Okay, Annika, it's happened to the best of us. We have turned up at childcare to pick up our little one at the end of the day, and we see the educator coming towards us with an incident report. And
Not the incident report.
drops. And you think, oh, God, what has my child done now? Or even worse, has something happened to my child?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a horrible feeling, but it's something that I think so many more parents than we realise go through. We've all received that phone call or been approached, like you said, at the end of, you pick up for daycare. And it's something that I don't think we need to be ashamed about, but we need to understand better. So we're going to have a chat to someone who can kind of take that panic stomach drop out of it as much as possible. Joining us today is Emma Rattenbury, an early childhood teacher and registered play therapist, and she is here to walk us through what to do when behaviour gets tricky in childcare and at home. Welcome to the show, Emma.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, Emma. We're so excited to have you join us. We have so many things we'd love to ask you from all your very varied experiences in early childhood settings. Can we start by asking, what are the most common behaviour-related incidents that educators are reporting on like a day-to-day basis?
There's quite a few, like it varies just because, behaviour is so varied and contextual. I mean, it can depend upon age group and things like that in terms of what educators are seeing. So it can definitely depend on what age group they are working with. So, starting with the 0 to 2s, we can see a few of those little bites maybe starting to come in. Sometimes babies are so curious about their friends that, their hands, they might want to touch their face, and sometimes that can turn into a bit of a scratch or a bit of a squeeze or a pinch and those sorts of things. In that young stage too, we're going through a lot of separation anxiety and things like that. So seeing a few tears, and that can result in a lot of, different behaviours. Jumping up into the 2 to 3 space, obviously we had that real big surge of that want of autonomy and independence with our beautiful 2 to 3 year olds. So we might see, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we might see a bit of an increase in biting, sometimes pushing, and some of those kind of reactions to whatever they might be experiencing in that space. And then the 3 to 5 year olds, that can be really varied as well. So we can definitely still see some of those behaviours around biting and, targeting our friends and our educators and things like that if we're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. I guess at the moment, we do report there seems to be a bit of an uptick in children struggling with their emotional regulation and needing some additional support from their educators and family members in terms of supporting them through some of those big emotions.
I'm really noticing when we hear the word like bite or hit or kick and imagine our child either doing that or being on the receiving end of that kind of behaviour, like little alarm bells kind of go off in my head, right? But you're talking about these things like quite casually, like these are sort of everyday occurrences. Is that reasonable?
I think so. Look, to a degree. Like, as I said, I think we have seen a bit of an uptick in children needing some additional support with their emotional regulation, which is, some of the underlying reasons as to why we see some of these behaviours that challenge. But it is really just a part of development and that we see in our early learning services every day. Children aren't just in that part of development where they're learning. They're really in a high demand situation sometimes in terms of having to share, and they're not at home and they're still, grappling with some of these big learnings that they have to do at that young age. I mean, you look at pretty much every checklist and things like biting and lashing out and all those sorts of things, you'll probably find them, at certain parts of their development as pretty appropriate responses for children of that age.
And I think this is such an important point, right? Because as an educator, Emma, you're saying you see this stuff every day and it's kind of business as usual. But as a parent, if you hear that your kid has been hit or kicked, it can be quite shocking and you're like, what has happened? But it is routine and everyday. On the parent side of reactions, what kind of reactions have you had as an educator when you have to have that difficult conversation with a parent that, oh, I'm sorry, but your child has either hurt someone or been hurt themselves?
Because, Emma, educators need to report on this, right? I think it's really important to know that whenever any of these kinds of incidents occur, you're writing a report, aren't you? And then upon pickup, you need to let both families know what's happened and the circumstances around it and what's being done to improve it. I can imagine every parent has quite a different reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can come down to a range of things like temperament, sometimes the order of the child, first child compared to, third, fourth and fifth, where they're like, I know that this is a stage, they've been through it before. So they know that, they'll get through that. They might have had a child who was similar and now they're a 10-year-old and they're not biting their friends anymore and those sorts of things. And sometimes, some families, for, lots of different reasons, but we understand that they're their children. And so it's never expected that a parent will always just go, I'm totally fine with my child being hurt. I think that reaction is completely understandable and warranted. And it is good to remind myself as an educator who sees this every day and, as you said before, can be quite calm and casual about it. It's something that I'm used to working in that space. But for a parent, as you said, it's not their everyday, particularly if they're just starting out in early learning or they're just coming into that part of development where it's happening a little bit more regularly and they haven't done that at home. It can be quite shocking. So having some empathy for families in that moment of really acknowledging their emotions in that space is really important. And it's important for families to not feel like shame for that because they're your child and that's your job to protect them and to keep them safe. And if there's shame about them already being in early learning and then they're having an injury on top of that, that can weigh down on parents.
Double
it's like,
whammy.
Right, I have to, I don't have any option, or I want them to go and now I don't feel like I'm doing my job properly. It's
when you say shame, Emma, are you sort of meaning more like a feeling of guilt? Because when this happened to me with my little boy, I turned up for pickup and I was told totally out of the blue, I'd never seen this kind of behaviour from my child, that he had taken a nibble, I guess. I shouldn't laugh. It's a funny word, nibble. Yeah. Had bitten his little, a little friend. Of course, you as educators, you're not able to tell us which friend perhaps was involved. And this is a really hard thing because as the parent who automatically goes, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry to hear that my child has potentially hurt another child or upset another child. What can I do to make this better? I want to apologize. I want to check on that other kid. We can't do that, can we? Because you can't tell us who is involved.
There is privacy and confidentiality. I mean, obviously when children get to a certain age, we know that's not going to, the children were probably going to tell you anyway when they get in the car. But obviously at that younger age, no. And, even then it's, privacy and confidentiality that we don't, name who the other child is involved, whether your child is biting or has been bitten. So that can be tricky too. And on the other side, it can be tricky in terms of, if you feel like your child is being targeted by a certain other child, which can happen. It's not necessarily bullying, but we can see a pattern that some children just seem to target others for reasons that we can't put it down to. It just happens sometimes. That it can feel like, maybe some parents do want to have a little chat and see what's happening here? Are you doing anything about it? In terms of trying to sort things out. So, and also I think it's really important for the rights of that child to keep it private and confidential for the child too, to make sure that that child is protected, that, they're really young humans and that they're going through moments and development, and we don't necessarily want people going around looking at children with certain eyes and things like that, or judging them. So it's also for the rights of the child that their own privacy and confidentiality is respected.
I think this is so important too, because kids hitting, kicking, biting, while we can see it as bad behavior, it's learning too, right? Kids learn by doing. So it's kind of part of it. But you mentioned before, and Kate, to your point, as a first-time parent, I've been that person where I remember I had an incident with my daughter where she was hurt by someone and they wouldn't tell me who, and I was outraged. It seems like common knowledge once you're in the system, but for first-time parents, that might actually be something you didn't realise. And I didn't realise. I'm like, what do you mean you're not going to tell me who's involved? So thank you for clearing that up, because I've been guilty of that myself. I absolutely outraged, as if you can't tell me. You can't even give me a hint. And then, of course, another kid walks out with a scratch on their face and a mum looking, you're like, so that's the kid that's involved in this one.
So I want to know, from Emma, advice to that parent that's a little bit like Annika. I'm guessing with
Crazy
your second
first time.
child, though, you weren't that mum
Yeah,
anymore,
no,
right?
second
You're like,
time
"Oh,
I was
okay."
like, yeah, you do become calmer, to your point. But yes, I have been a little bit crazy and overprotective, which I think is a really natural instinct for a lot of parents.
It is. It's natural instinct. And I think, yeah, if you've got other things on top of that, or a big long day at work and things like that, and you might be going, we all go through ups and downs in terms of our confidence as parents and things like that too. So maybe it's just hit at the wrong time in terms of confidence. It's emotional,
so
and everything
emotional.
kind of comes together, and all of a sudden you're like, I want to know who that 18-month-old was. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's like looking back, or you're like, oh, wow, where did that come from? But yeah, sometimes things just happen, and yeah, one of the reasons
I feel like
why.
this is the right time to lead into another really important question that we had. And it is, so we would tell the parent like Annika, hold up, because you need to trust that your early childhood provider is going to manage this situation. So as parents, say it is your child that has been hurt by another child, I would like to know, okay, thank you for telling me, what are you doing about it? Rather than thinking, okay, who was involved? I'm gonna sort this out.
Yes.
Is it best to leave it to the experts in this situation?
I think so, but also I think it's a fair question to really ask. I'm really interested to know, particularly if it's happening a few times and there's a bit of a pattern, to be curious and to say, hey, I'd be interested to know, what you're doing as a service. How is management supporting the educators in the room to do the best that they can? So, you might be looking at, I'm interested in your ratios. How many educators did you have in the space at that time? Or even just, looking at their policies and procedures and saying, oh, so you say you'll do this. Have you done that? Like those sorts of things. And again, that can be provided by the educators without going into detail about that specific child, if they have their own individual plan and those sorts of things. But, hopefully parents would be hearing things like, this is where, we're doing things to keep that child close to us in terms of like playing with, not shadowing or following them, but making sure that child's feeling safe in the environment. It might be providing extra sensory opportunities like crunchy biscuits or, ice and things like that for chewing, depending on what the underlying cause is for the behaviour, if it's biting and those sorts of things. So, yeah.
A little bit more than about these underlying issues for behaviour, because we've already said, look, it's developmental.
Yeah.
You don't know not to nibble on your friend's leg unless you've done it and got in trouble and been told, sorry, not in trouble, but, redirected or explained to why this is not appropriate behaviour. What other reasons? Because I'm sure some children, there are very many different reasons. You mentioned sensory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's, again, behaviour is so complex, so there could be a lot of different nuance and contextual information as to why children are behaving or why they're presenting with behaviours that challenge. Generally speaking, though, we put it into two kind of categories, and one being that it's an unmet need, or a particular skill is under construction or it's currently being developed or it hasn't developed yet. So children aren't waking up saying, hey, I'm going to bite my friend today. That's going to be fun. And that just, we don't really see that happening, that, these behaviours that challenge are coming from somewhere, and that it's communicating something to us that either, I think they might need support with their, expressive language, but they're two. And so that's just a brand new skill that they're only just starting to grapple with. Things like impulsivity. I've had children sitting right in front of me, and bang, an incident has happened, like literally right in front of me when we were playing. Their impulses are just so short, and it's really just at those, really early stages. I'm still struggling with it. If I go to the shops hungry, good luck to the chocolate aisle, because, I can't control myself sometimes. So
chomping on it before you've even started the ignition.
Right. There's more shells right at the checkout.
Got to
they
finish
get me
the
every
chocolate
time.
before you get home. Your kids eat them. Mum has to eat them in the car. I shouldn't share this with you.
And,
Hope my husband doesn't
I'm
hear
40, so expecting a 2-year-old to be able to even identify their impulses and then be able to say, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't the right choice. So, and you're right, there is an element of experience in terms of, oh, hey, when I do that, things don't really work out the way I thought they were going to. With some support and some different ideas and some problem solving and experience, children will eventually, ideally, find other ways and just also have their skills broadened in terms of they will have a brain that can control their impulses better. They will have more communication skills and more, awareness of, the self-regulation and those sorts of things. It's really a lot of like unpacking when we look at behaviour and looking what's underneath. It can be usually it falls into that, they're learning, or there's something going on here. So it could be sensory overwhelm and things like that. 2 to 3 year olds, again, they've got their language is still developing and their impulse control and those sorts of things. But if it's getting a bit older to another age, we might find some children just need that extra oral stimulation. So they might benefit from some crunchy ice or some biscuits throughout the day. So again, very nuanced and very individual. Yeah.
Of course.
So sometimes the behavior has absolutely nothing to do with what the child is feeling or why they're doing that thing, right? Like pushing over a chair isn't because they meant for it to hurt their little friend Bobby.
No, that's right. Like, sometimes it can really look like that, right? Because they're really angry and they'll throw something. So they're aiming. So it looks like you meant to do that. You were looking at that. You were meaning to, like, that's what you were aiming for.
My boy with his sister, for example.
That's right. And, yes, there is an element of, children, it might look like that, but you might find, is that actually just wanting to get control of the situation and their body is in a state of stress and fight or flight. And so their brain is not thinking, will this hurt that person or not? It's, I see that person as a threat, bang, I'm going to, and I need that threat to be gone kind of thing. So they will do, make some of those movements in terms of, going for them or throwing and those sorts of things.
Look beyond the surface behaviour to the broader context and then what underlying issue.
I love what you said before about the unmet need, because it might not be, even though they've thrown the chair, it might be because they actually don't feel safe or something's happened at home and now they're here. But I love that, looking under the surface. On the flip side of, handling it and implementing different strategies, what can you do as a parent if you're having that conversation? And I suppose it's probably more likely when your kid's the one who's, been hurt in some way. If you're not happy with the service's response, I know I've had this previously where I've expressed a concern and they're like, we're watching them, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
How can you, without needing to take it further, I mean, this is when we're talking about repetitive behaviour.
Yes.
What type of steps can you take if you just don't feel like as a parent they're doing enough about it, your childcare service?
In terms of where we're going to can depend on states. Obviously, we have a national, in childcare, a national quality framework and all those sorts of things. And also state, whether you're a state preschool. So depending on the state, so I always recommend to families they check, what procedure they might need to follow or where to go to. Ideally, though, you'd be going up the chain. So talking to educators, the room leader, and then potentially looking towards the nominated supervisor. Again, being aware of what the policies and procedures are that the service say they're going to do, and seeing if they are following through and if they have evidence of that actually occurring. If they're a service that's part of a wider organisation, there would be lines of, you might be an area manager and those sorts of things that you can go up to as well. And then when you're not happy with the overall support or response that you're getting from your service, there is reporting lines within each state, usually within the education department within your state, that you can call on and ask for support and potentially, making reports and things like that if you don't feel that children's safety is being valued and it is being upheld in that service, because that's what it comes down to as well, is child safety. And it's not just the safety of your child who might be coming home with injuries and things like that. It's also the safety of the child who might be, having those behaviours that challenge as well, and how we're supporting them, because sometimes we see it as an us versus them when it comes to children's behaviour in terms of, the child with the escalated behaviour, they're just winning and they're getting their own way. But a child who's in that state consistently is not winning. They absolutely, they
nor
are.
Is their family.
Nor is their family. That child is clearly communicating that they're in distress and their needs aren't being met. And so if we're seeing children, consistently like that, we should be advocating for their needs too, as well as our child if they are becoming the target of certain behaviours.
This brings us back to a recurring theme from all these incredible experts that we've spoken to over the past months, and it is the importance of communication and building really wonderful, I guess, open relationships with educators and our service directors and our children and our partners in our family so that everybody is on the same team, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And how you communicate that is really important too, like for educators in terms of when we go into conversations with families around, you know, behaviours that challenge, is that we're having these conversations because we want to support, because we see a child in distress or they're struggling. And this is our job. You know, we're not here to say you need to fix that child. We're saying, oh, something's not being met here or something's not quite right. How can we learn more about this child together to then create environments that are going to meet their needs and to help them thrive?
And as a parent, it's a lot easier to hear some of these sometimes really hard to hear facts about your child when you've heard it sort of progressively, little parts, little bits of evidence from day-to-day happenings, I guess, so that when you do deliver some news that maybe we aren't quite ready to hear, it's not a massive shock. We're a little bit prepared. I mean, it's never easy and it takes time, but gosh, I can imagine the delivery of some of these messages is a lot easier if you have a good relationship with a family and a parent.
Emma, on that, obviously there's certain things you can do while the kid is under your care within the service. Would you say it's equally as important with what happens then at home and the follow-up at home? Because biting is a great example.
Yeah.
Obviously, it might only happen when they're in amongst other kids and whatever, but are there things we can do at home to help with this? And what kind of role does an educator play in helping parents with that? Because I remember when we had biting incidents, I had no idea. Like, we talked about a mother-in-law last week. My mother-in-law was always like, if your kid's biting, like my first daughter was biting the younger daughter, bite them back. And I'm like, we are not biting them back. Yeah,
Get the soap out or the mustard or whatever
soap,
it is.
The chili on the tongue, the soap.
I
So
had to Google. I'm a teacher. I've worked with children before, but the biting was
It's
a
hard.
really new thing for me. And I remember Googling it, like, what do I do?
Yeah.
What am I supposed to say to my child? Do I tell them off and that they're going to be punished if they keep doing it? What do we do?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we go back to, again, what might be the underlying causes for some of these behaviours, we think unmet needs or skills that are still under construction or developing, we think, okay, well, how do we, you know, kind of meet those needs? So, you know, firstly, we look at, is there an unmet need here? So it's about being curious, right? And saying, what's kind of going on here? And would talking to or removing their favourite toy meet that need or fix that skill? Probably not. And we live in such a punitive society, and we grew up, like you said, in that environment where it was the soap or it was the mustard on the tongue and things like that. So to kind of not go to any punishment or significant consequence feels a bit uncomfortable sometimes for parents, because it's like, but I don't want them getting away with it. And it's just like, again, this is an unmet need or a skill that isn't developed. So it's like, you know, a child who's learning to ride a bike, we don't take away their favourite toy if they fall off.
That's really unhelpful.
That's not going to help that child learn that skill. We're going to say, when you were doing this, maybe try this instead, you know? And so it's the same with, you know, children learning skills or having their needs met that are going to support them in that environment, that are going to regulate their emotions and support them to grow and to develop those skills. So obviously, being a play therapist, I'm going to be a big advocate for play and child-led play, reading books, singing songs, sharing stories, going on the swing set together, those sorts of things. Creating lots of moments that are going to, recreate that sense of safety for children, that connection, but also it's going to slowly build and develop those skills that they need in order to start to go, hang on, I'm feeling a bit cranky, or I might need to ask my teacher for help instead of doing this, that, or the other. So we can talk about it at home in terms of if it's happened at home and say, I was talking and that happened. I'm being curious about it. And, you know, memory and recall memory, again, is another skill that children are still in the early stages of developing. So if it was something that was kind of managed and discussed at the time, now bringing it home, it might not really land, or, you know, it's a bit fuzzy. And particularly if the child was dysregulated, I'm sure you can relate that when you've become really dysregulated, you think about a moment, you're like, I actually don't know why I did that. Like, why did that? Oh, children are going to be the same in terms of, well, why did you do that?
There's
I
been
don't
times
know.
where
Like, I don't know. You
my
tell
boy,
me. You're the adult. I don't know.
I've had times where my little boy has done something, like we mentioned before, pushing over the chair or just like, throwing stuff off the bench because of some underlying issue that I was not aware of at the time. And after, when he's calmed down and I go to sort of talk about it, and I'm like, that wasn't a great thing to do. Like, he sometimes doesn't have any recollection of it.
Yeah.
Like, he was that upset or that dysregulated or stressed or hungry. I don't know. Sometimes he's just
all
hungry.
the things.
All
he
the
was
things.
so angry, upset, whatever. It's like he can't even remember it happening. But for me, it was huge. I was embarrassed and I was like, this is shocking.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I think, Emma,
absolutely.
you made such a good point about consequences, because I think for a lot of us, I think the three of us are around the same age, we were raised with bad behaviour equals bad consequences.
And the
it's
threat
really
of a
hard
consequence
to undo.
will stop us doing that behaviour. But when you are behaving in a way because you're dysregulated or you have an unmet need, you're not thinking about it.
But I think this is also, for me, where that guilt comes from. So that when your child is the one that's hurt someone else, you have that immense amount of guilt where you want to, as a mum, you've had nothing to do with it. It's not because you've raised your child in the wrong way, but you have this need to apologise or fix the situation. Emma, what would you say to a parent to help them deal with that guilt or try and take some of that burden off? Because I know we're our own worst enemies with that stuff. Well,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, again, just acknowledging that, and it's painful sometimes as parents because, and like most good parents, they see it as representation of themselves. And that's not always the case in terms of, like we said, children are just going through a stage of development. And I've seen many children go through, particularly in the 2 to 3 space of just their mouth was the way that they like to communicate with their friends. And it was constant. It was most days. And then, a year and a half later, they're in the preschool room, not a worry in the world. Everything's, going, so for that parent at that time, it's really hard to see the future. And again, sometimes it's helpful if they are an older sibling, but sometimes if the older sibling is, very, by the book and things like that, sometimes you get a second or a third child that throws a bit of a spanner in the works in terms of a surprise. But in terms of, what we say to families in those moments, it's really just acknowledging where they're at in their emotions and just say, I get this is so hard. But if we see them like, what can I do? How can I help? Like those sorts of things. We say, look, that's the act of a good parent in terms of acknowledging that. We don't need parents, crying and feeling horrendous about it. Like we certainly don't need that. But even just parents saying, oh my goodness, okay, well, what are some tips? What can I do? Those sorts of things, kind of working together in that collaborative relationship. If the educators are coming to that too, that can be a really great way to kind of support families to kind of look ahead as well, because you can feel quite stuck in it, particularly if it is just a developmental stage that children are going through and there might not be any additional concerns, or you've just moved house, or there's been a big shift and things like that, and children just go through a bit of regression from time to time. Supporting them and giving them the little wins as well, and trying to catch those little wins in terms of, this happened today, and you know what? They asked for help, or they put their hand up, or they looked for me before they did this. So I'm starting to see something shift here. This is really exciting that they're starting to, expand and try different strategies before maybe going into something else. Yeah.
Emma, I know many times early childhood educators are on the receiving end of a really unhappy parent, and it's often misdirected emotion coming from the parent. But unfortunately, educators do really cop it sometimes, and especially when we're talking about some of these like really tricky behaviours or incident reports and things. To a parent whose first thought when they hear that something hasn't gone right or their child has acted a certain way that's not desirable, and their first thought is to blame the educator, blame the service, blame the other kid or the other kid's parent for being a shit parent. Like, what would you say to that parent in a calm moment? What would you tell them to consider before they lash out and blame people.
If they were the parent of the child who has the
behaved.
behaviours.
Yeah.
I think, again, this is really important how this conversation is presented to families. I think, sometimes if it's presented in a way that, I don't know where this is coming from, or this is just doing this, that, or the other, so I think it's really important from educators' perspective to consider how this is presented to families as well. So really trying to come from that strengths-based lens and that curiosity lens. I'm a big fan of curiosity and asking why. Dr. Stuart Schenker's work around stress and the brain is really interesting in terms of one of his best strategies is when we're feeling stress is to just stop and think why, so it can get us thinking in terms of, fixing what might be going on, but also it can, kind of step us out of that really emotional response sometimes. So coming at some of these discussions with some curiosity and saying, hey, I've noticed this has been happening, or, this is happening at the moment, or this happened and their response was this. I'm wondering if you're seeing this at home, and those sorts of things is a great way to, approach parents in terms of how we're, delivering that message. If a parent is on the other side of that message and they're receiving that their child might be struggling with something, take a breath, take a breath first. Sometimes, it could just be like a blip in time. It's not, please, and I know this is, I'm a parent, I've done this myself, so I feel like I need to take a leaf out of my own book here, but try not to think, down the track in terms of, oh my goodness, they're going to be this, that, or the other, or, oh my goodness, no, it couldn't possibly be my child, those sorts of things. And just go, and ask some questions, but curiously just go, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'd like to know more about what that looks like, or, that's really interesting. I haven't seen that at home. That's one we do get regularly in terms of having families say, I've never seen that at home. And that can be with good reason in terms of the home and the early learning environment are two completely different environments. Yeah. So the demand on children in your early learning service is going to be so much more. So imagine having, 25 children in your home and your child having to share everything in their home. There might be you and maybe their auntie and their uncle looking after 25 children, and you might get an idea of actually the amount of extra demand that children are experiencing in early learning services, and that brings out behaviours sometimes that we won't see at home. Sometimes it does, and for families, there might be certain behaviours or habits that children are doing, and naturally over time we've adjusted ourselves so we're minimising it, but it's still there, if it was another demand. So sometimes, educators will say, oh, but, a family's not saying that that's happening at home, but then in the next sentence, this will kind of come out. And so sometimes as a parent, you laser focus and things like that. So you miss things sometimes. And I did it myself as a parent in terms of, oh yeah, I do that, so it doesn't result in a meltdown or something like that. So it's a totally, common thing to do as a parent that, we're just looking at our child from one particular lens, but once they head out to an early learning service, it's a whole lot broader, and they're going to have different demands, and they're going to more than likely, behave differently because they're in a completely different environment.
And I think, Emma, this goes so well with the point you made right at the start of this chat that we've been having, that this is expected from children of all ages at all stages. As an educator, it's something you see every day. So when someone's bringing it up with you, or the service is approaching you, it's not because your kid is bad or naughty.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
something that's quite every day. Or that you're a bad parent.
Yeah.
Precisely right. So I think if anyone's listening, just know that the likelihood is, whether your kid's the biter or the one getting bitten, this stuff happens, but I feel like it's all a learning process. Same way as adults, you have to make mistakes to learn. It's the same with kids. They need to try it to learn. So
can we also just quickly recap in that it is not like you mentioned before, Emma, that there was, I'm stuck on my cord. Emma mentioned that she had some children right in front of her, and an incident, I don't know what happened, it was biting or kicking or something happened right in front of you. You were there, you were supervising adequately, and this just happened so quickly without warning. So it's not necessarily that children aren't being supervised adequately, right? It is,
that's
or
absolutely.
that there aren't enough staff.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's where, asking some of those questions can be helpful. But even in the services with the highest quality educators and programs and those sorts of things, it's still a natural part of development. And we're still offering a group care situation. So it's not like home where they're 1-on-1 or 1-to-2 if they have a sibling and those sorts of things. In a preschool room, it's 1-to-10. So, 10, imagine having 10 children at home on your own and trying to, these things are going to happen, in that space because
these
children are still learning.
Have too.
Exactly, that's right. I know it can happen one-on-one as well. So the added pressure, so when there are incidents happening, it's not always a representation of the quality of the care. It's a representation of children being at a certain stage of their development where there's some pressure placed on them, or they're still developing some really crucial skills in terms of communication and their emotions. So we're going to come across conflict.
So as a parent, be super happy when you arrive at pickup and you have an incident report to read with your educator, because that means somebody is following up.
It's a good sign.
Looking out for your child and the other child, and they're communicating with you. These are all really, really important things in a quality early childhood setting, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and there are also great opportunities to ask those questions in terms of, this is happening a couple of times, like
communication, right? It brings us back to that. Building relationships with your educators and the families, so important.
Yeah, and it is really tricky in an early learning service. We're trying to maintain the rights of children as individuals and as a group as well. So, and that's always this seesaw that sometimes we tip this way and sometimes we tip that way. Ideally we'll be somewhere in the middle most of the time. But, it can be really, really tricky sometimes.
Thank you for giving us this perspective, Emma, like from a parent perspective and from all the different sides of a situation or behavior. Like, it's just, there's so much to think about, and it just goes to show it. Before you get upset about something, consider it from different angles and different perspectives, and the context as well is super important.
Yeah,
and look for some underlying issues, because children aren't just bad, right?
No, that's right. That's right. And if it's starting to get to a stage where, it's starting to impact their growth or development or their capacity to engage in a service, reach out for some support. I think that's one thing that families still need to hear about. I mean, the stigma around mental health and those sorts of things and behaviour, it's still very much out there. I think we're getting better at it, but the thought of, oh my goodness, calling a psychologist for my child is still quite overwhelming for some families. Like, I'll pass that information on and you'll see a bit of a twitch and things like that. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Get the help. There's so much, like, for yourself as well, like life could be actually easier if you just ask for help, because the psychologist might just be a couple of appointments, but they're great at talking to the family and then talking to educators and then creating a holistic view of the child and giving strategies moving forward.
There's the same with like OTs and speeches. There's some amazing things I think you can do, and not to be scared, but to see them as a support, because if anything, they might just help you through that phase, or maybe it's long term. If anyone is listening along and loves all the amazing tips Emma has, I want you to go across to her socials and follow her, because I follow her quite a lot. And what you've heard is just a snippet of the kind of content that Emma covers. If you are a parent and you are living this early childhood experience, hop across,
or
because
if you're
I promise
an educator that wants to have a giggle at some of your POVs, like hilarious.
When you laughter's my favourite medicine. You need it. If I don't laugh, you'll cry.
Yes.
Much needed, especially in this industry.
Absolutely.
In this day and age, yes,
this
absolutely.
day and age in general. Emma, thank you so much for your time, for all your amazing insights. It's been an absolute pleasure. We will drop all her details in the show notes, and hope you've enjoyed listening along with us.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Thank you.